Hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great Player. My name is Guy and today we are looking at player versus player. Now this is a very contentious topic within the role-playing community, and I have heard players talk about they love PvP, that's the player versus player, and I've heard players say that they hate it. I've heard GMs that say that if the players want to attack each other, they can go and do that and they must just handle it. I'm going to step back and watch it unfold. I've heard GMs say, I don't allow player versus player interaction at all. It just doesn't happen, and when it starts, I just stop it straight away and say you're not allowed to fight and then move on. I've had other GMs say, well, they allow it to happen, but they remove all the dice rolls and the players have to talk it through and discuss it through. So we're going to look at three of the elements that you as a player can apply when you're either involved in player versus player or two of your fellow players at the table are involved in this. Now, of course, I'm saying player versus player. I'm not talking about literally you reaching across the table and beating the snot out of your fellow player. I'm talking, of course, about your character versus your other player's character, the character versus character. But player versus player is the more accepted term, I think. So we're talking characters fighting characters, not necessarily players fighting players. So that's where we then turn to. Our very first thing to look at is the idea of intent. What is the intent? Is it actually player versus player? Are you actually unhappy, upset with your fellow player? When you watch two players having their characters fight, is it the character fight or is it the players fighting? Now, an example that I give on this channel all the time is I have witnessed only once in my gaming career player versus player where the characters are really just the punching bags, but it is the players fighting against each other. And that was a murder. Literally, several of the players ganged up against one of the other players and murdered his character in such cold blood and with such venom and animosity and out of character sort of approach that the player at the table realized that they were no longer welcome at that table. The players were so aggressive in the way they did it and so unrepentant and so unrelenting that the message was very, very clear. It was player versus player. That, to me, is not good role-playing. It's not good role-playing. It's metagaming. It's the players using the characters as an expression of their frustration and their anger. That is a bunch of players who should have been speaking to one another saying, I really don't like the way that you're playing the character. I find it difficult. That's players who should have gone to the GM saying, I can't handle this player at the table. That player needs to go, or I'm going. I can't sustain playing with that particular individual. They irritate me. I can't handle it. I just cannot handle it. That's absolutely valid. You are absolutely entitled as a player to go to the GM and to your fellow players and say, listen, this other player is really rubbing me up the wrong way. Is it me? Is it them? How do you feel? Maybe I need to reassess how this whole thing's being approached. That is absolutely something that you are entitled and allowed to do and encouraged to do as well. Discuss, understand, and unpack when talking about players rather than when talking about characters. On the other hand, if it is the character's journey, if the intent for the conflict is the characters coming together and fighting and finding a common ground or defeating one another, that's a very different story. And you need to handle that in a way that you're not necessarily encroaching upon the other player's narrative ground, but that you are working towards it. And if you're watching two players' characters fighting, if you know that the players want this to happen because it's their character's journey and it needs to happen, then you need to step back and to let that happen. If your character gets involved and you don't know the situation, you don't know if it's the players or if it's the characters. If your character gets involved, they need to get involved in a way that makes sense for the character to get involved. And preferably, you should try and test the waters. See if the two players are smiling when they finish their discourse. See if the players are smiling at one another when they finish their characters screaming and shouting and hitting one another. If the players are smiling, it means that this is part of their story, it's part of their characters. Then feel free to jump in, but react appropriately. React that if the players turn around and have their characters say, "Get out of here! You're not welcome. Leave us alone." Realize it's not the players who are telling you to get out and to leave. Well, okay, let me rephrase that. It's not the characters necessarily who are doing that, although they are. It might be the players saying, we've got something planned, so back out. We don't want you to come in and aggravate the situation. Again, those players should have indicated to you beforehand that this was happening. If you're planning on having a character versus character conflict, a player versus player conflict, let your party know beforehand. Say, listen, all right, so we're working out this thing. We've got this animosity that's happening between the characters. Now, hopefully coming out soon is The Adventures of the Star Swift, which is a game that I'm playing a character, and a very difficult character. He's a very, very angry captain of a ship, and his brother, who is just a complete mirror of how he used to be, is now forced upon him, is forced into his ship, and the relationship is incredibly strained. And in one of the adventures that we've recorded, the brothers come to a head where there's a confession, a very emotional confession from the younger brother, and my character just broke. He snapped, refused to talk to the character, and stormed out. We had warned everybody before we started playing that this was the kind of relationship that we wanted to explore, this antagonistic butting of heads. We want the brothers to get to a point where there's physical violence and they just pouring out their frustrations with the world, with the galaxy, with the space into one another because they're so similar. And the one is trying not to be because he's hiding things behind it. The other one was hiding things. We had a big revelation in that character's past, and now they've been abandoned by their brother. We want to explore that as a dynamic within this whole role-playing space. It's a really complex kind of narrative to add into a role-playing game. So I made sure that although the captain is completely angry with his brother and not talking to him, he will still issue orders to his brother. And when his brother gives him a feedback that's of a tactical nature, which is the role that the brother plays, he will respond to that. He won't just automatically dismiss it. Now, one of our other players was involved in this discussion, and he, knowing what we were trying to do, tried to help continue that, not by poking or stoking the fires. What he did was he went to my captain. He said, you are still the captain of this ship, so as angry as you are, as frustrated as you are, we still need orders to come from you. What a wonderful role-playing space. We've got these relationships that are busy building. We've got these characters that are starting to develop such interesting facets. All the while still playing in the GM's game, because the GM is still running a story. They're still running a narrative. The characters have to be cognizant of that. We as players have to be cognizant of that. So intent, what is your intent with player versus player, is very, very critical. And how you handle it is equally as critical. If we then move to the outcome, what is the outcome going to be? And there's a spelling mistake here, but the outcome, what is the outcome? Is it character death? If it's character death, if you want your character to die at the hands of another character, at the hands of another player's character, there are going to be consequences. And although it says here group moral, it's actually group morale. What happens to the group when that outcome is seen? If the player character has been villainous, has been treacherous, has been devious towards the party, and your character is the one who eventually ends up killing them, group morale might go up. There might be a sense of, well, that's a thorn in our side that is now gone. We can now move forward and we can refocus and we can rebuild as a group. So the group morale might go up. But if it was a character that the players simply got bored of playing and wanted their character to have an exit, and so this whole thing came about, group morale might go down. I have often seen it, especially when the character was fairly central to the story or was in charge of the group, and that character now dies, is removed, and all that's left is a new character who was brought in by the same player. There's sometimes a loss of energy. There's sometimes a loss of group care. If you're starting a new character, we might as well all start new characters, because that can be so destructive. So think about player versus player. Think about the consequences of your outcomes. I kind of jumped around here in this one because I kind of feel that it makes more sense this way. So consequences. How do you resolve that? Now, something that the player and I, in this the example that I've been giving, something that we're very aware of is how are we going to resolve it? At the moment, I don't think either of us really know how we're going to resolve it. I do suspect that we're going to go more of a cinematic solution where the brothers get to a point where they're fighting against one another and they realize that they're putting everyone else at jeopardy and they come together and they do that sort of thing. We did have that almost happening at the end of one of these sessions. I really hope these sessions come out so you can go and have a look at them. But the idea of how is this going to resolve is we both know that the resolution of this is that the brothers come together, they come together stronger and better than when we were first introduced to them. That's the arc that we've kind of got planned for this whole process. How that's going to happen, we're still exploring that, and that's part of the fun, as we're still deciding how we're going to get there, where we're going to get there. Is the brother going to steal a shuttle and go rogue and try and live on their own and then end up in danger and the captain's going to have to save him? Is the captain going to abandon the ship? Who knows? That's part of the fun of doing it this way. Death is always, in my opinion, a wrong way to go. And there's actually a video made if you want to change your character. Don't kill them, change them. Let them reflect upon the outcomes. Let them grow, let them adapt. You can change your class or your style or your personality by having these moments of catharsis where you realize, my character was a warlock who was bitchy and I don't want that anymore. I want to play a priest who's pious. The character can go through those major emotional experience where they join a priesthood and they start to seek that piousness. And as you move from being this bitchy character to this pious character, that's an interesting journey that you can take. So if you consider these kinds of things, your player versus player becomes a much richer experience and a much more constructive experience rather than a destructive experience. And that's really what we're looking for here. Now, intervention, we have sort of mentioned it as this video has been going on. Do you intervene? When do you intervene? As a character, as a player, when do you intervene? I think there is nothing wrong, absolutely nothing wrong with you as a player when you're seeing player versus player happening, saying, hang on guys, just a quick question. Is this between the two of you as players or is it between your characters? If they both say, oh, no, it's between the characters. No, don't worry. No, nothing from us. This is characters. Let it carry on. Then your character is entitled to take sides, is entitled to intervene, is entitled to apply consequences, that maybe they lose trust in their trusty captain, maybe they leave because they can't handle this kind of conflict, maybe those kinds of things. They leave, but of course they're going to come back because we don't want to break the party up. They leave to create more of an emotional tension, an emotional narrative that the other players' characters then have to resolve to then rebuild the family and kind of get the player group back together, the PC group back together again. If it is player versus player, again, intervene as well. Don't take sides unless you believe it to be true, but I don't think that's the best way to resolve conflict. If it's player versus player and the players are busy hammering it out, you say, listen, this is obviously something between the two of you. Let's talk about that, and we're going to stop the game because the game is going to be disrupted by this. Now let's talk. What's making this happen? How do you feel? How do you feel? How does that make you feel? How does that make you feel? Is this something that's a personality? Is it a this? Is it that? Let's unpack. Let's explore. Rather make it a constructive session than a destructive session. So player versus player gives you that opportunity. It's really, really useful when it does crop up to be able to do that. That's pretty much it on intervention. If it's player versus player, stop it, look at it, unpack it, explain the consequences to the other players. They might be very emotional. You actually have to, you must take that into account. So if it starts getting too heated, call a timeout and say, right, guys, this is very tough. Let's all go and grab a coffee. Let's go and get tea. Let's go and get soda. You can see that I've given up coffee for the last 2 weeks. I'm talking about coffee. Go and dissolve the situation and then unpack it and discuss it. That's the best advice I can give you. So often I get emails from people saying, I've got player issues. How do I resolve it? Talk about it. As difficult as it is, sit in a group and talk about it. It's a great adulting moment. It's a great adulting life. My suggestion is ask, prompt, question, express your feeling, and then listen. Listen to what these people are saying and try and discover the solution. And sometimes the solution is that the players just don't work well together and they have to just be separated. I had two players who were friends outside of the game. They relatively still friendly as far as I know back in South Africa, but put them around the same table together, and this animosity just bubbled up from both of them that literally led to deadlocking and arms folding and fine. Couldn't explain it. Could not explain it. It was just that they just antagonized one another on a fundamental level, and they just didn't work well together. And we had to accept it and say, right, well, that's one D&D group, that's another D&D group. It's time to realize that you can only go so far in player versus player. So I hope this has been helpful to you as a player in terms of how to look at PvP combat, how to look at character versus character combat, so that you can understand that it's an opportunity, it's an incredible opportunity for great narrative, for great storytelling, for character growth, for party cohesion, but it can also be an incredibly destructive force if it's done in the wrong way. And if it's player versus player, that's a totally different kettle of fish, that's a totally different space, and one that you need to unpack as quickly as possible, because otherwise your group will just crumble and disappear. And that's the last thing that we want. We want our groups to stay together. Otherwise we have to go and find more people with which to play. Anyway, until next time, I hope you and yours manage to find resolutions, manage to enjoy and experience and explore one another through conflict that is happy, as contradictory as that might be, that is excited and that's curious to see how to resolve it and bring about a successful conclusion in the end. Until next time, I wish you and yours the very happiest of playing.